The first shock hit like a gavel in a quiet courtroom. Prince William had always believed Diana's last words were beyond palace manipulation, already examined, protected, and safely shelved. He thought time had sealed the danger. He was wrong. Because inside a locked archive box at Windsor, officials uncovered a private document with Diana's signature, her handwritten corrections, and a final message addressed directly to her sons. And when William read the closing lines, something in his face went still. Not grief alone, recognition. The kind that arrives when you realize your family story has been edited, above politics, beyond attack, until now. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now, enjoy the video. It started during a security review that was supposed to be routine. Archivists called it custodial hygiene, the kind of careful work people never notice until it fails. Yet within that review, they found a sealed envelope that had not been released according to any timeline William had been told. The record didn't just show custody, it showed classification. It showed restrictions that had outlived the explanations attached to them. It showed a deliberate decision to keep Diana's words from reaching the man who was expected to inherit the crown. And once the message existed on paper again, the past stopped being history and became evidence. William, for his part, did not react like a man surprised. He reacted like a man cornered. He lowered the document as if the table had suddenly become hot. His grip tightened, the way people hold on to something when they suspect it can be taken away again. Then he returned to the first line. The tone was unmistakably Diana, intimate, fierce, and frighteningly precise. She didn't write to the palace. She wrote to two boys who, even in adulthood, were still being handled like political assets. Her closing lines didn't sound like farewell. They sounded like warning. And warning is a different kind of heartbreak. She had feared the division that now defined their lives. That was the first thing William understood. Not in an abstract sense, not as tabloid speculation. She feared something specific, something mechanical, something that could be triggered by procedure and protected by distance. In the message, she urged William to protect Harry, but she also insisted on a boundary. Never surrender his conscience. Never let love become rivalry. Never let authority turn a brother into an enemy you can manage. She asked them to keep a bond alive that the institution had treated as negotiable. And as William read, he realized the hardest instruction wasn't the plea for unity. It was the demand that neither son accept control as duty. The palace, of course, would later try to frame it all as a misunderstanding of classification, a technical error, a long-delayed authentication, something fixable with formal review and tidy statements. But the archive record told a different story, and it told it with the blunt language of stamps and dates. This wasn't misplaced. It wasn't lost in an attic or delayed by bureaucratic confusion. The envelope had entered palace protection years earlier, and then, repeatedly, it had been handled like a risk. A guarded collection, yes, but guarded for whom? And why? Because the message wasn't just restricted once. The restriction had been renewed after both brothers reached adulthood. That part landed hardest. It meant the silence wasn't only after Diana's death, it was long after the world had moved on. It was long after the temporary caution promised to grieving families. The document had been logged, it had been restricted, and it had been kept away, while William and Harry lived decades with the absence of Diana's final words between them. The archive sheet showed at least 3 authorization marks, then revealed something that made the room feel colder. One order was later buried beneath a newer security classification, like someone tried to bury a truth under paperwork. William traced a reference number beside the authorization stamp. His stomach tightened as the trail connected the message to an office still operating close to the heart of royal authority. The mechanism had endured. The judgment had endured. The control had endured. And that was only the beginning, because the message didn't read like a passive farewell. It read like a woman who had watched power devour tenderness. Diana warned that powerful figures might one day encourage division for their own convenience. Not because they were cartoon villains, not because the palace wanted open cruelty, because two isolated brothers were easier to guide, easier to pressure, easier to control. Her documented words did not name specific people, but the warning felt disturbingly close to the life her sons were now living. Somewhere between them, silence had hardened into something neither man seemed able to cross, and William suddenly understood why every conversation had felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. When William asked whether Harry should be contacted immediately, the senior archivist didn't hesitate. That alone was suspicious. People in institutions rarely speak fast unless they've already rehearsed the safe response. The archivist had seen the record. The archivist had already measured risk. William lowered the page again and looked at the custody log attached to the cover. It proved the envelope entered protection through formal channels. It proved a chain of command, but it also proved that someone had repeatedly prevented the moment Diana intended from happening. Her sons were not meant to receive the message decades later, as strangers to it. They were meant to receive it when they were old enough to understand the burden waiting for them. "Not until I know who kept this from us," William said, and the words sounded controlled. But the emotion underneath wasn't controlled at all. It was anger that had been waiting patiently. The archivist lowered his eyes, as if the truth had suddenly become heavier than paper. William's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. He was heir, yes, but in that room, he was also a son, confronting a betrayal that didn't have a clear face. That's the kind of betrayal that destroys trust from the inside. Not because it's loud, because it's hidden. When the story leaked, because stories like this always leak, eventually, the public reaction arrived like a wave that couldn't be stopped. Social media turned the phrase, "final message," into a countdown, and journalists started refreshing timelines the way gamblers refresh odds. The BBC led with restrained language. The Guardian leaned into the implications. Anonymous palace sources began offering partial context, the kind that sounds careful until you realize it's also convenient. One pundit from Oxford University, speaking in measured terms, argued that classification decisions can become governance tools. Then he paused, and the pause became a message. This wasn't only about documents, it was about power. The escalation happened in stages. First came the confirmation that Diana's correspondence was recovered and authenticated. Then came the shock that it had never been released as promised. Then came the public anger, not only because the message existed, but because it contradicted what William and Harry had been told. Polls appeared within hours. Online surveys circulated claiming the majority of respondents believed palace secrecy had contributed to the brothers' rupture. Comment sections filled with old wounds disguised as new outrage. And every time a reporter asked why now, the palace responded with phrases like custodial review and reclassification. But the archive record didn't speak in those soothing terms. It spoke in dates, stamps, and restricted labels that had outlasted any reasonable excuse. In the middle of this chaos, William tried to remain calm. But calm is not the absence of emotion. Calm is emotional discipline. Catherine noticed the shift before the prince said anything. She found him reading the same paragraph repeatedly, fingers fixed against the edge of the page, like the text could anchor him to reality. She didn't interrupt immediately. She waited until he looked up. Then she asked a quiet question, the kind that sounds gentle until it forces a decision. Did he want reconciliation, or did he simply want an explanation for everything that had happened? William stared at the glass as if he could see through it. Then he admitted he no longer knew whether the two brothers could be separated into duty and pain the way the palace demanded. Understanding Harry might require forgiveness, but forgiveness could demand more trust than either brother still possessed. And then the message delivered its most unbearable instruction. Diana had written separate lines for each son, but she also added a handwritten requirement. The brothers must hear her final words together. The implication was brutal. Sending Harry a copy would violate her request. Delaying contact would deepen the secrecy that had already shaped their lives. Either choice threatened something William couldn't afford to lose. Not just reputation, not just stability, something human. The bond that had been held at arm's length for years. That's when the palace began to act like a machine again. An aide entered with an archival record, a formal history showing when the document was received, restricted, and moved. William studied the first entry and went still. Diana's message had been logged immediately after a tense family meeting years earlier, meaning the decision to seal it wasn't random, it wasn't late, it was immediate, which raised a terrifying possibility. The message didn't disappear because someone lost it. It disappeared because someone decided to keep it out of the boys' hands. And if it began right after a specific meeting, then the secret had a birthplace, a room, a moment, a decision that became policy. The escalation sharpened, because the record connected that meeting to October 1997, a turning point where grief, royal caution, and fear of scandal collided behind closed doors. A private secretary had opened Diana's envelope during that meeting and read part of it aloud, as if the words could be assessed like a risk assessment report. That secretary was a senior official who managed confidential communication for the royal household. One advisor immediately warned that the letter's criticism of outside control could turn the young princes against the institution. The room fell silent. Then the envelope was ordered into temporary sealed custody. Temporary. For the institution, temporary meant until we decide otherwise. And until we decide became permanent silence. Charles had been in that meeting, carrying grief, guilt, and an impossible responsibility. He reluctantly allowed a delay, according to later summaries from palace records. The king believed the restriction would end when the boys were emotionally ready. But no date was fixed, no review was scheduled. Temporary caution quietly became permanent control. William felt anger sharpen as he reached the final section of the archival sheet. 3 authorization marks appeared. Then he saw the buried name under another security classification. Someone renewed the restriction later, even after adulthood arrived for both brothers. And worse, the renewed order had been signed during the same week William and Harry stood united at a memorial ceremony honoring their mother. Unity, at least in public, had been possible. Yet private words remained locked away. William didn't ask questions in that moment like a bureaucrat. He demanded them like a son. He requested a private meeting with Charles, no secretaries, no advisors, as if he could isolate truth from the palace's habit of softening it. He entered with only 2 sheets of paper, but the weight wasn't the documents. It was the implication that his life had been shaped by information withheld. Charles saw Diana's signature before William spoke. For several seconds, neither moved. Then William placed the document on the desk and demanded the truth. Had Charles known the final message existed while his sons believed, for decades, that Diana left no final words? Charles dismissed the last aide and closed the door himself. That detail mattered. It suggested the king wanted no official record. Yet it also meant the conversation was political in the worst way. Not because it was staged, because it had been avoided. Charles looked again at Diana's handwriting. He admitted he remembered the 1997 meeting. Then the truth began to unfold like a slow betrayal. Charles claimed fear had shaped the delay. He believed releasing the message immediately could deepen grief and intensify anger. He believed the restriction would end once the boys were stable enough to handle it. But stability never came in the way the palace imagined. It came as a split between 2 men who learned how to survive without each other. William didn't argue like a courtier. He accused like a son who had carried pain too long. He told Charles the letter had taught both brothers to hide their wounds while smiling through royal duty. Protecting the monarchy, William implied, had become inseparable from avoiding grief and blame. Charles flinched, because that accusation pierced a core of royal identity. The institution claims duty. It rarely admits avoidance. And once that conversation turned personal, the palace's language failed. Then Charles confessed something William had never heard. Years after the original meeting, the king asked why the letter remained sealed. A senior official told him Diana's personal representatives had withdrawn it from release. It was a neat excuse. Clean, plausible. A story that would let Charles believe he wasn't complicit, but the newly discovered archive record proved that explanation was false. Diana's representatives had never requested withdrawal. That meant the silence had a different author, a different motive, a different method. And William pushed the second sheet across the desk, pointing to an obscured authorization mark. Charles recognized it, and his face changed. It belonged to a former senior courtier, a powerful palace advisor who worked behind the scenes to guide royal decisions. The room went quiet, because the implication was chilling. Real control belonged to an office capable of locking away a private truth under the language of protection. Someone hadn't merely stored Diana's message. Someone had decided how Diana's words might affect the monarchy, then used that judgment to keep them away from her sons. Charles realized his authority had been used as a shield for someone else's judgment. "I should have made certain you received it," Charles said quietly. It wasn't an apology designed to satisfy headlines. It was a confession meant for one person at a time. Yet it confirmed a darker lesson. Even kings can be led by procedures they don't challenge. That afternoon, the palace narrative would shift from administrative error to something less convenient for PR teams. Journalists began hunting for the name behind the authorization mark. Analysts began talking about institutional memory, as if it were a living entity capable of deciding who deserves truth. Even radio hosts, who usually defended the monarchy, started to sound uneasy. Because if a former courtier could keep a message sealed for decades, then what else could be sealed? What else had been temporary and became permanent? The scandal wasn't only that Diana's message existed. The scandal was that the institution had treated love like a security threat. Meanwhile, Catherine noticed another anomaly. A second envelope number, hidden beneath a handwritten correction, had been missed in earlier checks. When she compared the archive register, she discovered the message originally contained an accompanying page. It was missing now. The entry described it as personal instructions, the kind that would explain when, where, and under what conditions the brothers were meant to receive the letter. The absence felt deliberate, not accidental, and when William found an internal memorandum, an internal note recording palace reasoning, the document offered a justification that sounded almost unbelievable in its cruelty. Releasing Diana's words might encourage her sons to place personal loyalty above constitutional responsibility. In other words, Diana's private plea for unity was twisted into a threat against the crown. It's the kind of rationalization that turns emotion into offense, and it explains why the document could be treated like contraband. In a palace, public stability can become a convenient phrase for controlling private relationships. William watched the current custodian unlock a narrow drawer where the accompanying page should have been stored. Inside sat only a faded card bearing 3 words: "Removed by authority." Removed by authority, meaning someone later decided even the internal instructions could be taken away. William demanded a complete custody search. But while archivists began to move, another clock started ticking. Because Harry, across the ocean, received a call before William had the chance to contact him properly. Not a public announcement, a private contact, familiar with the archive search, delivered the information with urgency. Diana's message. William had still not contacted him. For Harry, that timing echoed an old fear. When the palace faced a dangerous truth, William was brought inside while Harry remained beyond the door. Decisions about their mother were happening again without him, just as they had happened after her death. Harry's anger didn't disappear. It surged, and grief turned into a sharper kind of betrayal. Harry didn't first hear Diana's words from William. He heard they existed from someone outside the room. That detail hit him harder than the message itself. The palace had controlled Diana once. Now it was controlling access to her again. In that brief moment, Harry's worldview snapped into focus. The institution wasn't simply protecting the monarchy. It was protecting its own narrative by controlling who learns what, when. And once that belief formed, every pause looked like design. William had delayed contact for 2 reasons. Diana's handwritten instruction required both brothers to hear the message together, and the missing accompanying page made William doubt whether the discovery was complete. William wanted integrity, certainty, originality. But to Harry, integrity and secrecy sounded too similar when you've been on the outside of both before. William's silence had begun to repeat the very pattern Diana had warned against. And then Harry called William directly. His voice shook as he demanded to know why archivists, advisors, and palace officials had been allowed to decide when he was ready to hear his mother's words. William tried to explain the missing page. Harry cut him off. He had already spent years being told explanations were protection. Now the explanations sounded like delays. Then Harry revealed something that shifted the conversation from accusation to authentication. Diana had told him never to let anyone convince him William had stopped loving him. Harry carried those words privately for years, even through their bitter disputes. More importantly, Harry possessed an old handwritten note containing a phrase that might authenticate the missing line. Stand beside each other by choice. The phrase wasn't just emotional, it was corroboration. It could prove Harry's note belonged to the same final message. It could also explain why palace officials considered Diana's instructions dangerous, because she had placed freedom of choice above palace pressure. William felt the meaning immediately. The phrase matched the emotional direction of the recovered letter, and it turned the missing page from a random absence into a keyhole. William locked the library door, dismissed any waiting aid, and called Harry back without anyone listening. Silence stretched. Then William finally spoke. We read it together, or neither of us reads another word. It wasn't a compromise. It was a condition rooted in survival. Harry agreed to meet privately, but with one demand. William would bring the original document. The Crown would stay outside the room. That condition mattered more than the archive. It meant no officials, no cameras, no palace briefings, no institutional spin. For the first time in years, William and Harry prepared to meet not as Prince and Duke, but as Diana's sons. Their plan included a private residence far from formal palace offices. No public statement would shape what happened next. They would answer only to each other and to the mother whose words had finally arrived. This mattered because trust between them had collapsed whenever private pain became public material. Diana's message would not become another headline weapon. Not while they were still choosing whether they were capable of love without control. When William began reading Diana's words aloud, the anger didn't vanish. It never disappears on command. But forced proximity changes everything. The room became a container for emotion that couldn't be outsourced. Diana's message asked them to challenge one another honestly. Forgive without surrendering dignity. Remember that duty or distance could never erase shared childhood. She didn't demand agreement on everything. She demanded recognition of the wounded human being behind titles and accusations. Harry lowered his eyes when a sentence warned that pain could turn brothers into symbols instead of people. In that moment, Harry admitted something that had been buried for years. He had sometimes spoken about William as though William were merely the face of an institution. It made anger easier. It also made him forget the boy who shared his grief. William confessed too. He acknowledged protecting the monarchy had sometimes become a reason to avoid difficult conversations. Silence had been his shield. It had prevented fresh arguments, but it had also left Harry believing duty mattered more than their bond. Diana's message exposed it as fear, and fear is the enemy of reconciliation, because fear always claims it's doing the right thing. Then the handwritten note from Harry appeared beside the missing line in the archival copy. Stand beside each other by choice. The phrase completed the sentence perfectly. It clarified the deeper instruction. The suppression wasn't only political. It was Diana's private belief that reconciliation had meaning only when love was freely chosen, not engineered by palace procedures. William finished reading, folded the document, and placed it between them. Harry moved his chair closer instead of reaching for the next page. Neither offered grand apologies. Neither promised instant peace. They agreed, quietly, that their mother's words would never be leaked, distorted, or weaponized against either brother. Their decision was private, yet it was also explosive. Because once the world discovered a recovered message, the public wasn't going to stop at authentication. The public would demand access. The public would demand meaning, and the palace would be forced to respond. By sunrise, a private family reckoning had become a national story. The public wasn't only curious about royal romance and betrayal. People recognized the unresolved grief around Diana and the two young sons who once walked behind her coffin. But now the question wasn't only, what happened then? It was, why was it hidden? Who benefited from the brothers' division? And did reconciliation actually begin, or did it just become another performance? Broadcasters framed it as a turning point. Some called it proof that the monarchy could still adapt. Others called it proof the palace had been rewriting the family's past with classifications instead of compassion. The palace responded with a careful statement confirming the discovery, authentication, and delivery of Diana's personal correspondence to William and Harry jointly. Personal correspondence, not official record, not government business. It was intended for family. It sounded like protection, but the confirmation shattered decades of silence. Because the most dangerous thing wasn't what was read, it was the fact that the message had been real and withheld, and then finally released when it became impossible to keep quiet. Charles then ordered an independent review of how sensitive family documents were classified. He also directed that no inherited restriction system could remain active without fresh authorization. It was an attempt to interrupt procedural control with procedural accountability. Still, the fallout didn't stay inside palace walls. Critics attacked Charles for permitting the original delay. Supporters pointed out that grief is unpredictable and difficult. But even those supporters had to confront one embarrassing truth. Temporary caution became permanent control. And when permanent control is exposed, even loyalty to tradition looks less like respect and more like complicity. Harry issued a joint statement, agreeing not to publish the complete letter. He understood that releasing everything might satisfy curiosity, but it would turn Diana's final words into a weapon for public conflict. For the first time, both brothers chose protection without allowing the palace to control their choices. Outside Kensington Palace, people gathered by the gates, leaving flowers and handwritten messages. A photographer captured crowds holding up newspapers with headlines that now read like moral instructions. One front page carried the phrase, "Her final words, do not let them divide you." Reporters described the discovery not as instant reconciliation, but as the first major decision William and Harry had made together in years. That distinction mattered. The brothers had not erased conflict. They had chosen agency, and agency is what institutions fear most. Institutions can survive arguments. They struggle when individuals refuse to let procedure decide love. William watched the coverage with Catherine. He switched off the television when an old photograph of himself and Harry appeared. He did it without theatrics. He did it like a man trying to keep his history from becoming a spectacle. Catherine asked whether he regretted meeting his brother. His answer was immediate. No. He regretted it took Diana's voice to make them listen. That line traveled faster than any official statement. And in its simplicity, it carried the entire scandal. Not the message itself, but what it revealed about time, control, and the cost of delayed truth. The final meaning of the document wasn't found in a single dramatic sentence. It was found in what the brothers chose next. William ordered that Diana's original message be placed inside a jointly controlled family archive, requiring approval from both brothers before anything could be opened, copied, or released. The palace would no longer control Diana's words alone. Then Charles removed the inherited restriction system that had allowed an old classification to survive without review. An archival review would be mandatory. Sensitive material could be preserved, but it could not be locked away forever under another person's authority. These weren't just administrative changes. They were declarations that the monarchy could no longer hide behind inherited procedure when the consequence was emotional destruction. Harry reached a different conclusion, just as painful. Reconciliation couldn't be demanded through interviews, public statements, or pressure. He agreed to rebuild contact privately and stop turning every conversation into evidence for one side. Trust, if it returned, would return slowly, but it would no longer be replaced with abandonment. Diana's message carried its power through balance. She didn't ask William to rescue Harry. She didn't order Harry to accept every royal decision. She asked both sons to remain human when duty, anger, and public judgment pushed them into opposing roles. Love could survive disagreement only when neither person tried to control it. And now the public is left with the question the palace can't answer in a press conference. If Diana's message was suppressed through stamps and security classifications, what else was filtered out of the brothers' lives? What other decisions were made in rooms where Harry wasn't allowed in, where William was gently guided, and where procedures replaced honesty? And if the independent review truly finds wrongdoing, will it point only to retired courtiers, or will it reveal the deeper architecture of control that still lives inside the system today? Because once people learn that private truth can be locked away, they stop trusting any version of history that arrives too neatly. So tell me this, when the archive opens, how much will the monarchy have to confess before protection becomes something else entirely? And if William and Harry's private agreement holds, will the world accept peace that nobody can profit from, nobody can stage, and nobody can weaponize? Or will the pressure of headlines force new leaks, new betrayals, and a second round of war, dressed up as stability? Stay tuned, subscribe, because the moment Diana's voice broke through the palace walls, it didn't just rewrite a family story. It exposed a question the institution can't survive unanswered.